The paramedic said the first dose only bought so much time. Eleanor heard it in the elevator going down, "AP wears off, 15 minutes maybe 20, and she understood the words but kept sliding off the weight of them, because Jo was leaning against the gurney rail with her eyes half closed and the skin under her jaw swollen in a way that hadn't been there 30 minutes ago when they were arguing in the kitchen about the recycling. "I'm fine," Jo said. She'd said it when Eleanor found her at the counter with one hand pressed flat against the cabinet. Said it in the car. Said it now while a paramedic adjusted something on a monitor and did not agree with her. "You dropped the EpiPen twice," Eleanor said. "Got it on the third try. That counts." The elevator opened. The paramedic moved fast, talking to a nurse in shorthand Eleanor couldn't follow, and then Jo was through the double doors and Eleanor was at an intake desk with a clipboard and a form between her hands. She found the section. Relationship to patient. 4 boxes. Spouse. Parent. Sibling. Other. Eleanor Voss had run a publicly traded company for 11 years. She had signed documents moving 9 figures before her first coffee. She had sat across from people whose entire professional purpose was to make her hesitate, and had not once felt her hand pause over a signature line. She stared at those 4 boxes long enough that the intake nurse looked up. "Ma'am?" Eleanor looked at Other. At the blank line beside it. She picked up the pen, cheap, light, the kind that skipped if you pressed too hard, and wrote the word that was technically true. Roommate. The letters came out slightly uneven. She wasn't sure she'd ever written anything unevenly before. She slid the clipboard back and sat in a chair bolted to the floor beside a vending machine with an out-of-order sign taped over the coin slot. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, the Kestrel term sheet, needed a yes before 6. She turned it face down on her knee and left it there. That was new. She had built Voss Dynamics on a policy of being unreachable for no longer than 40 minutes at a stretch. Right now she would have sat in this chair until morning. A nurse appeared at the double doors. "She's asking for you." Jo was upright in the bay, fur taped to the back of her left hand, color returning in patches. Her voice was still slightly thick. "You wrote roommate," she said. "Not a question. That's what you are." Jo looked at her, not hurt exactly, not angry. Something more careful than either. "Right," she said. "That's what I am." A monitor beeped somewhere behind the curtain, patient and unbothered, and Eleanor Voss stood at the edge of that hospital bay unable to explain why one word in her own handwriting had just cost her something she didn't yet have a name for. She had the name. She'd had it for months. She just hadn't written it anywhere that counted. They shared the penthouse on the Upper West Side, 1 kitchen, 1 hallway, 2 bedrooms with a wall between them. Eleanor had started listening through at night. She'd listed the spare room in January under her mother's maiden name, Marlowe, telling herself it was a rational response to 4 bedrooms and 1 person's silence. She had not anticipated Jo Bennett. Jo was 29, taught 3rd grade in Bushwick, and had answered the listing in 3 sentences. She'd moved in with 4 boxes and a jar of loose buttons she placed on the kitchen windowsill without explanation. 7 months later, Eleanor still didn't know what they were for. She'd stopped asking. They kept Jo 5 hours. The attending used the word biphasic in the hallway and drew a small timeline on a prescription pad. A second reaction could follow the first, sometimes worse, always worth watching. Eleanor asked 2 follow-up questions. The attending reassessed her slightly and said someone would check in every 45 minutes. Jo was nearly asleep when Eleanor came back to the bay. Shoes on the floor beside the gurney, toes pointing out, neatly paired. She always lined her shoes up when she took them off. Eleanor had noticed this in the first week and had filed it, without meaning to, under things that were now simply true about the apartment. She sat in the plastic chair and turned her phone face up long enough to text Marcus, "Handle the Kestrel call, I'll review the sheet tonight." Then turned it back over. She told herself she wasn't waiting. She was simply present. The distinction felt important and may not have been. Joe Bennett moved through spaces at the speed of someone who had decided, at some earlier point, that a room was worth being in. She made coffee like it was an activity. She read at the kitchen island with her chin in one hand and turned pages slowly. She left cabinet doors open, not all of them, never the same ones twice, and Eleanor had found this maddening for 6 weeks before noticing that a guest had closed them all one afternoon and the kitchen had felt, briefly, wrong. She kept the jar of buttons on the windowsill. Eleanor had asked about it in February. "What are those for?" Joe had looked at the jar. "Buttons. Why are they on the windowsill? Where else would they be?" Eleanor had not had an answer and the subject had not come up again. What Eleanor had not anticipated, listing the spare room in December, was the specific experience of having someone else's presence reorganize a space she'd lived in alone for 4 years. Joe didn't treat the penthouse as hers. She treated it as real, inhabited, actual, a place where a person lived rather than a luxury property that happened to contain a person. The distinction, Eleanor had learned, was enormous. Joe was also stubborn in a way that had nothing to do with her warmth. In April, Eleanor had miscalculated Joe's share of the electricity bill and left a 20 on the counter with a note. Joe had put it back on Eleanor's desk with the note flipped over and one word written on the back in red teacher's pen. No. Eleanor had tried twice more. Both times Joe moved the money without comment. On the third attempt she said, without looking up from her grating, "I know what my half is. Don't manage me." That had been the end of it. Eleanor had thought about that phrase, off and on, for 3 weeks afterward. They discharged Joe just before 2 in the morning. She walked out under her own power, which she made a point of, taking the nurse's offered arm and releasing it after 2 steps. In the car she had her discharge instructions on her lap and was reading them with the expression of someone who intended to file the information and never think about it again. "Avoid shellfish," she read aloud. "Carry an epinephrine autoinjector at all times." She turned the card over. "There's a diagram showing where to inject it. In case I forgot where my thigh was." "You dropped it twice," Eleanor said. "I was having a reaction." Joe set the card on the seat between them. "I got it." They drove the rest of the way in silence. Not uncomfortable, weighted, the specific gravity of something unfinished that both of them, for different reasons, had chosen to leave where it was. Upstairs, Eleanor found the paramedic's timeline diagram in her jacket pocket. She sat down at the kitchen island and read it all the way through. The buttons jar was on the windowsill behind her, catching the ambient light from the city. She'd looked at that jar 1,000 times in 7 months and still didn't know what the buttons were for, and found, sitting there at 2 in the morning with the diagram in her hands, that she didn't especially need to. The photo ran at 6:51 in the morning. Eleanor knew the exact time because Marcus called at 6:52, and Marcus did not call before 8 unless something needed immediate damage control. She was already at the kitchen window with her first coffee, watching the park below do something reasonable with the early light. She looked at the photo before she answered. Someone in the waiting room had taken it through the gap in the curtain. Eleanor's hand on Joe's shoulder. Joe's head tipped slightly toward her. The 4-line visible in the background, which confirmed the medical context but did nothing about how the image looked. The caption read, "Voss Dynamics CEO Eleanor Voss at Manhattan Urgent Care Thursday night, who's the mystery woman, 2 sites," Marcus said when she picked up. "One of them has reached. Kestrel's assistant emailed my assistant 20 minutes ago asking if there's anything we want to address before Thursday's dinner. She's my roommate. She had an allergic reaction." That's the complete story. That's also what it looks like, which is the problem. A pause that answered itself. "I'm not saying it's a crisis. I'm saying Priya Adani has been looking for reasons to slow this close for 6 weeks, and right now someone handed her a variable. I need a clean, boring line before Thursday. Personal acquaintance. Medical emergency. Nothing further to address. That works. Get it to comms by 9. She hung up and stood in the kitchen with the photo still on her screen, looking at her own hand on Joe's shoulder in the blue hospital light, and tried to decide what the boring, final, door-closing word actually was. Jo came out at 7:30, poured coffee, and found the article herself. Eleanor watched her read it. Mystery woman, Jo said, to her cup. Flat. Fun. Comms will handle it by noon. What does the statement call me? Personal acquaintance. Jo set her cup down. So last night I was your roommate on the hospital form, and this morning I'm your personal acquaintance in the press statement. She said it without heat, stating a fact. I'm trying to understand which category I actually fit. Jo, I'm not fighting with you. Still no heat. More careful than that. I'm noting that the word changes depending on what's convenient for the situation, and I'd like to know if there's a version of this where it stops changing. Eleanor thought of 11 answers that would close the conversation cleanly. None of them were true enough. I have the Kestrel dinner Thursday, she said instead. I need this quiet until then. Jo looked at her for a long moment, the reading expression, the one that meant she was deciding what something said rather than just what it showed. Then she picked up her cup and went to the sink and rinsed it out with her back to Eleanor. Okay, she said. The tone that did not mean okay. The comms team handled the photo by 11. By afternoon the story had nowhere to go and stopped going anywhere. Eleanor told herself this was a resolution. That evening Jo cooked and left a plate in the refrigerator for Eleanor with a sticky note listing heating instructions. Eleanor came home at 10, heated the food, ate it at the island alone. It was very good. She did not thank Jo the next morning because Jo had already left for school, and she wrote a note and then threw it away because it seemed excessive, and then felt, obscurely, that she'd done something wrong, which was an unusual feeling for her in the context of ordinary domestic life, and one she did not examine too closely, because the last time she'd started examining things like that she'd ended up reading a paramedic's diagram at 2 in the morning instead of sleeping. The buttons jar was on the windowsill. The hook by the door held Jo's good coat. The kitchen had the quality it always had when both of them had been in it recently, and Eleanor stood in it alone and felt the difference between that and what it was now, and said nothing to anyone about any of it. The comfortable thing about the following week was also the dangerous thing, it made not saying easier. Jo hadn't applied for Albany yet. Eleanor knew because Jo had mentioned a curriculum position at the district office, better pay, better hours, Albany, 2 weeks ago, and had said she hadn't decided, and Eleanor had said you should do what's right for your career, and Jo had looked at her with an expression Eleanor was still thinking about. They found a rhythm that required nothing from either of them. Dinners that alternated without being assigned. Evenings in the same room without agenda. A Saturday morning where Eleanor worked at the kitchen island while Jo lesson planned beside her and they were quiet together for 3 hours, and it felt, in a way Eleanor had no professional language for, like exactly the right use of a Saturday morning. She kept not saying the thing. There was a Wednesday when she almost did. Jo was on the couch reading, feet tucked under her, book held in both hands the way she held things she was genuinely inside. Eleanor came out of her office for water and stopped in the kitchen doorway because the lamp caught Jo at an angle and the apartment had the particular settled quality it only had when both of them were in it and not working, and she felt the thing she always felt in these moments, a fullness that had nowhere to go. She got her water and went back to her office. She knew she was doing this. That was the worst of it. The first real crack came on a Friday, from a direction Eleanor hadn't been watching. A compliance analyst on the internal audit team flagged a discrepancy. The penthouse lease listed E. Marlowe as tenant, but the building ownership records showed Eleanor Voss as title holder. The memo asked for clarification on the tenancy arrangement and whether the occupant had been vetted under the company's related party policy. It had been addressed to legal and CC'd to 2 people Eleanor did not want near this. She intercepted it within the hour, resolved the discrepancy with 1 call, reclassified the unit as a personal residence, and had the CC'd copies recalled. Clean. Fast. Contained. She told herself it was no different from any of the 100 other fires she managed in a given week without narrating the process to anyone. She did not tell Jo. The situation was resolved. There was nothing to tell. This was true and was not the whole truth, and she knew the difference, and filed that knowledge in the same place she'd been filing similar knowledge for 7 months. Joe found out on a Thursday, 1 week before the Kestrel dinner. Priscilla's partner had seen the flagged memo in a forwarded chain, not the full text, just enough to recognize the address and Joe's name, and had mentioned it to Priscilla as an oddity, and Priscilla had told Joe over coffee in the teacher's lounge because Priscilla mentioned everything. Joe came home quiet. Eleanor noticed and attributed it to end-of-year pressure and did not investigate. It surfaced after dinner. Joe said, without preamble, there was a compliance memo about my name on the lease. Eleanor looked up. Priscilla's partner saw it. Joe's arms were crossed, posture watchful rather than angry. You knew. I handled it. Same day. It was a routine flag. You didn't tell me. There was nothing to tell. It was resolved. There was something to tell. Joe's voice stayed level, but something under it had gone load-bearing. My name came up in your company's legal system because you listed this apartment under a name that isn't yours, which I figured out in February and didn't push on, because I thought you'd explain it when you were ready. She uncrossed her arms. I've been waiting for you to be ready for a lot of things. In the meantime, your legal department is looking at my name and you're handling it quietly, and I'm finding out from Priscilla. I should have told you, Eleanor said. Yes. Joe looked at her steadily. There's a difference between protecting me from a problem and protecting yourself from a conversation. The sentence landed exactly where it was aimed. Eleanor didn't move away from it. You're right, she said. I made the wrong call. Joe nodded. One nod, finished. I know you did. She went to her room. Eleanor sat at the island a long time after, looking at the buttons jar on the windowsill, feeling the specific, accumulating weight of all the right calls she'd made about the wrong things, and the one conversation she kept choosing, methodically, not to have. Joe hadn't meant to find out where the dinner was. She'd called the office line that afternoon, not Eleanor's cell, which would be silenced, hoping to catch the assistant, wanting to know what time to expect Eleanor home. She had something to say and wanted to say it in person before she lost her nerve. The assistant, helpful and entirely unaware that any of this required discretion, said, she's at Marchetti's on 63rd, private room, probably through by 10. Joe had thanked her and hung up and told herself the whole train ride into the city that she wasn't going to interrupt anything. She just wanted to see Eleanor's face when she said the word Albany out loud for the first time. She'd applied that afternoon. She wanted Eleanor to know before it became a fact she'd received by text. She got as far as the top of the stairs before a host stepped forward and the noise from the private room carried through the half-open door, and she understood, in full, what she'd walked into. She should have left. She stayed. Eleanor was mid-sentence, integration timelines, one hand moving to illustrate a point, when the door opened and Joe was in it. Still in the blazer from the curriculum workshop, conference lanyard gone but its ghost pressed into the fabric at her collar. She took in the table, 11 people, linen. Crystal, and her eyes found Eleanor. I'm sorry, she said, to the room. I can wait downstairs. Joe, Eleanor was already standing. Who is this? Priya Adani asked. Pleasant. Absolute. Eleanor had a half-second. She knew what Priya had asked about the hospital photo. She knew what she'd answered, personal acquaintance, nothing relevant. She knew the close was 11 days away and 3 years of work were on this table. She's my roommate, Eleanor said. Joe, I'm sorry, this isn't a good time. She heard it leave her mouth. She watched it land. Joe's expression did something small and careful and complete, the specific rearrangement of a face receiving information it was half prepared for and deciding not to show what it cost. Of course, Joe said. Sorry to interrupt. She pulled the door closed behind her with the quiet of someone who has decided not to make a scene and means it. The conversation resumed. Priya moved them back to the earn-out provisions. Marcus caught Eleanor's eye across the table and looked away. The food kept coming. Eleanor answered questions for 90 minutes with the competence of someone whose brain, when required, could operate independently of everything else she was experiencing. She signed the preliminary agreement at 9:55. Priya shook her hand. The legal teams exchanged folders. She sat alone in the private room after everyone left. Her phone had one message from Joe, sent at 8:31, "I'm sorry for interrupting. I should have called first. I hope the dinner went well, she read it 3 times. The careful courtesy of it. Written to require nothing from Eleanor, to give her maximum room, to take up minimum space. She thought about Joe in the doorway, understanding immediately what she'd walked into and staying anyway, long enough to try. She thought about the word she'd used. She thought about all the words she hadn't used in 7 months. She typed it did. Thank you sent it. Sat with the cold, specific clarity of someone who had made the most efficient possible decision and lost the most important possible thing, and understood that these were not 2 separate facts but one. Joe was in the kitchen when Eleanor got home. 11:15, school night, sitting at the island with a glass of water and the stillness of someone who had been there a while. I need to explain, Eleanor said. You don't have to. I want to. Joe waited. Not warmly. Not coldly. Present. Priya has been looking for leverage for 6 weeks, Eleanor said. If I'd said something different in that room, she'd have had a thread and she'd have pulled it. The close isn't final. 11 employees' jobs are on this table. I understand the business logic. Joe's voice was even. What I don't understand is what the word is supposed to be when it's not in front of Priya Adani. When it's just us. In this kitchen. She looked at Eleanor directly. 7 months. I need to know if there's a version of this where you say the other word, or if the other word doesn't exist. The true answer was right there. Eleanor could feel its shape exactly. Behind it, the familiar architecture of reasons to wait. The close wasn't final, the board meeting was next week, she didn't have the right language yet. I don't know how to do this without getting it wrong, she said. Joe nodded. Small. Finished. She picked up her water glass and stood. Albany called this afternoon. They want a formal interview next week. She looked at Eleanor one moment longer, not with anger, with the careful settled look of someone making peace with a decision. Good night, Eleanor. The door closed. Quiet. Never a slam. Eleanor stood in the kitchen alone and understood that she had been so afraid of saying the wrong thing that she had said nothing at all, and that nothing at all had turned out to be the most wrong thing available. The distance assembled itself quietly, the way serious things did. Not as an argument or confrontation, as a series of small precise adjustments to the ordinary texture of the apartment, each one individually explicable, collectively unmistakable. Eleanor catalogued them the way she catalogued most things, methodically, without yet knowing what to do with the information. The coffee was first. For 6 months Joe had made too much, always, and Eleanor had used the surplus, and this had become a fact of the morning without ceremony or discussion. The Monday after the Kestrel dinner Eleanor came in at 6:40 and found a single-serve amount in the pot. Enough for one. She made her own and the kitchen felt different in a way that had nothing to do with coffee. The book disappeared from the kitchen island. Joe had been leaving her current read there since February, face down. Eleanor had complained about the spines twice, Joe had acknowledged and continued. Eleanor had stopped complaining because the book had become something she looked for when she came in. Now the island was clear 3 mornings in a row and Eleanor found herself looking at the empty space and feeling that something was wrong with the room. Joe's good coat migrated from the hook by the door to the closet. The hook held a scarf briefly, then nothing. Eleanor looked at the empty hook every morning and every evening and did not rearrange her own things to fill it. She tried on a Tuesday. Came home at 6:30, deliberate about it, moved a call to make it possible. Found Joe at the island with assessment folders and sat down across from her without stated purpose. Joe glanced up. Back to her folder. I handled the dinner wrong, Eleanor said. Jo put her pen down. Did not look up immediately. I know. I handled a lot of things wrong. In sequence. I know that too. Jo looked up now, direct and patient. I'm not waiting for you to say that. I already knew it. She picked the pen back up. Albany's interview is Thursday. I'll need the dining room from 2 to 3. I'll clear my calls. You don't need to. I want to. Jo looked at her for a moment, the reading expression, slower than usual. Okay, she said. And went back to her folder. Eleanor sat another few minutes, unwilling to leave, unable to say anything useful, and then went to her office and closed the door and did not open her laptop for 20 minutes. She cleared her calls Thursday and went to a coffee shop 4 blocks away. Worked there for 2 hours with her coffee going cold and her phone face up on the table. At 3:12 Jo texted, I think it went well. Eleanor typed I'm glad, sent it. Looked at it on the screen. Felt the specific inadequacy of the words, correct, supportive, giving Jo maximum room, and about as emotionally honest as a form letter. The offer came the following Monday. Eleanor came home to find Jo at the island with her phone in front of her and the stillness of someone sitting with news that changes the shape of things. They offered, Eleanor said. This afternoon. Jo turned her phone over. It's a good offer. Eleanor sat down. The kitchen was quiet, no cooking show, no off-key singing. The buttons jar caught the evening light. The empty hook was visible from here. What do you want to do? Eleanor asked. This time she meant it differently, and Jo heard the difference. Something moved in Jo's expression, not quite hope, too careful for that. A door set slightly ajar. I want to know what I'd be staying for, she said. Not in general. Specifically. I've been here 7 months and I've been present for this, whatever this is, and I need to know if you've been present for the same thing. She held Eleanor's gaze. Before I make a decision that moves me 2.5 hours away. This was the moment. Eleanor could feel it, the exact pivot where everything after would be determined by the next 10 seconds. She looked at Jo's hands flat on the counter. The cracked phone screen between them. The jar of buttons catching the last of the evening light behind her. I need a little more time, Eleanor said. Jo looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and her water glass and stood. Okay, she said. The closed version. The finished one. I'll let you know what I decide about Albany. She went to her room. The door closed. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen and understood that she had just been given the thing she'd asked for, more time, and that it was the last thing she should have asked for, and that the patience she'd been counting on had just become something with an edge and a direction. The direction was away. Jo called Albany on Tuesday morning. Eleanor heard it through the wall, not the words, just the cadence. The professional voice Jo used when she was being deliberate. It lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, the apartment went quiet and Eleanor sat at her desk and looked at her open laptop and did not read what was on the screen. Jo knocked on the office door at 9:15. Didn't come in. I accepted, she said, from the doorway. Start date is August 1st. I'll be out by end of July. Okay, Eleanor said. I'll find my own place up there. I'm not asking you to, I know you're not. I'll figure out the lease overlap. I don't want you out of pocket, Jo. Eleanor's voice came out stripped. Don't worry about the lease. Jo looked at her for a moment, the reading expression, slower than it used to be, like she was translating something she was tired of translating. Okay, she said. I have to get to school. And she left. The front door closed with its usual click and Eleanor sat at her desk and did not move for a while. The following days had the texture of a clock she couldn't stop watching. Jo was not unkind. She moved through the apartment with the same basic consideration she'd always had, kept common spaces tidy, said good morning and good night, occasionally mentioned something about her day. But the easy intimacy of earlier months had contracted to something more deliberate and bounded, The way a person moves when they have committed to leaving and are managing the transition with dignity. On Wednesday a box appeared in the hallway outside Joe's room. Sealed. Labeled in black marker, books just one. But one was a beginning. On Friday Joe had dinner with Priscilla, came home at 10, said goodnight in the hallway. On Saturday morning Eleanor made coffee, enough for two, old habit, she didn't catch herself until the pot was full, and sat at the island and looked at the buttons jar and thought about asking, one more time, what the buttons were for. She didn't ask. The question felt like something she'd run out of standing to ask. She called her therapist on a Thursday. "I've made a serious mistake," she said, within the first 5 minutes. "Tell me about it." "I've been living with someone for 7 months. I've known since February that it was more than what I was calling it." "I haven't said so." "Now she's leaving." "Why haven't you said so?" "Because saying it makes it real. And if it's real and I get it wrong, what does getting it wrong look like?" "She leaves anyway." "Except then it's not just the situation. It's the thing itself." Her therapist was quiet. "Eleanor. What are you afraid of losing?" "Her." The word came without qualification. Simpler and more absolute than she was accustomed to. "I'm afraid of losing her." "Then the conversation you've been postponing may be more urgent than you've been treating it." "I know. What's stopping you from having it tonight?" Eleanor looked at the window. I don't know if she'd believe it. I've used too many words that weren't the right words. I don't know if the right word now means the same thing it would have meant in February. That's something only she can tell you. She left early. Walked home, 40 minutes through the city, hands in her pockets, phone in her bag. She got back at 5:30 and found Joe in the kitchen packing the cabinet above the refrigerator. Items she'd accumulated over 7 months, organized now into a second box on the island. She was wrapping a mug in newspaper, careful with it. The blue one. Eleanor had bought the set years ago and had never had a preference among them until Joe started using this one specifically, and then it had become, in Eleanor's mind, Joe's, not because anything formal had happened, but because the blue of it on the drying rack had come to mean that Joe had been in the kitchen that morning. Eleanor watched Joe wrap it and set it in the box. That was mine, Eleanor said. Originally. Joe looked up. Do you want it back? No. Eleanor moved to the island. Stood across from the box. Stood across from Joe. I've been doing something. For a long time. Where I know something clearly and don't say it because I'm waiting to be more certain, and I'm never more certain because certainty isn't how this works, and I know that, and I keep doing it anyway. Joe had her hands on the edge of the box. Listening. Her expression careful, the face of someone who has been offered beginnings before and is no longer sure what they precede. I don't want you to go, Eleanor said. Not because of the apartment. Because when you're not. Here the apartment is wrong in a way that has nothing to do with the apartment, and I've known that since February, and I've been calling it other things because I was afraid of what happened if I called it what it was. She looked at Joe directly. I'm in love with you. That's what it is. That's what it's been. The kitchen was very quiet. Joe looked at her. The careful expression held, steady, deciding. That's the word, she said finally. Low. That's the one I've been waiting for. I know. I'm sorry it took, Albany called this morning, Joe said. They want to confirm my start date. She looked at the wrapped mug in the box. I told them I'd call back tomorrow. Eleanor waited. I'm not undoing the decision on one sentence, Joe said. That wouldn't be fair to either of us. But I told them tomorrow. And it's today. She met Eleanor's eyes. I need to hear more than one sentence before I know what tomorrow's answer is. Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat at her desk until 2 in the morning, not working, looking at the city through the window. At 2:15 she opened her laptop and drafted a memo to the lead attorney on the Kestrel close. The sole discretion clause, the provision she'd spent 3 weeks negotiating, giving her unilateral authority to finalize terms without board sign-off, she was removing it. Replacing it with joint approval. She sent the memo before she could think carefully about it, which was, she recognized, probably the only way it was going to get sent. The attorney called at 7:45. This clause took 3 weeks to negotiate, Eleanor. I know. The board is going to want an explanation. I'll give them one. Which is what, exactly? That I've been operating under the assumption that my individual judgment was the most reliable instrument available, and I've revised that assumption, and joint oversight is appropriate for a close of this size. A pause. The deal is still clean. The date is still the 22nd. The only thing that's changed is a governance provision that Kestrel's team actually prefers. She hung up and called Priya Adani. Priya picked up on the third ring, surprised. Eleanor. The paperwork looks clean. We're still on for the 22nd. I'm not calling about the paperwork. Eleanor kept her voice level. The woman at the dinner last week. I told you she was my roommate. That's technically accurate and it isn't the whole truth. She's someone I'm in love with. We live together. I used the smallest available word because I was protecting the close, and I'm telling you now because I don't want to start an integration relationship with Kestrel on the basis of a misrepresentation, however technical. A long silence. That's an unusual call for a Thursday morning. I imagine so. It doesn't affect the deal. I want to be clear. What you do personally has no bearing on the close. I know. That's not why I'm calling. Then why are you? Because I said something in that dining room that cost someone something real, and correcting the record with you is the one part of it I can actually fix. She paused. And because I was more afraid of you than I was of losing her, and that order was wrong, and I wanted someone who could have hurt me for it to know that. Priya was quiet for a moment. I'll see you on the 22nd, she said, and hung up. Eleanor knocked on Joe's door at 8. Yeah, Joe said. Awake. Can I come in? A pause. Yeah. Joe was sitting up in bed, the careful alertness of someone who had not entirely slept. Eleanor sat in the chair by the desk rather than the edge of the bed. The room held 2 boxes now, the second smaller than the first. I called Priya Adani this morning, Eleanor said. Told her what I should have told her at the dinner. What you are. What this is. She looked at her hands. Not to ask you to make a different decision about Albany. Because you deserve to not be the smallest accurate word I could find. Joe was looking at her steadily. I also gave up the sole discretion clause on the Kestrel close. The attorneys are unhappy. The board will be unhappy. I'll deal with that. She paused. Not as a trade. Not because I'm offering you something in exchange for staying. Because I've been treating control as a substitute for honesty for a long time and I'd like to stop, and sometimes stopping means actually surrendering. The control rather than just deciding to feel differently about it. The room was quiet. Outside the window the morning was gray and close. What I did at the dinner was wrong, Eleanor said. Not complicated wrong. Just wrong. I had the word available and chose a smaller one because I was protecting myself, and I told myself I was protecting the deal, and that was also true, but it was second. You were not second. She stopped. Found the right shape of it. You haven't been second since February. Probably earlier. Joe looked at her for a long moment. Hands loose in her lap. Not fidgeting. I'm not asking you to stay, Eleanor said. Albany is a good job and you earned it, and if it's what you want it should be yours without conditions. But I'm asking you to know that the word I have is not roommate and not personal acquaintance and not other. It's been the same word for months and I kept not saying it in the right place to the right person, and I'm saying it now, in your room, on a Thursday morning, with nothing writing on it. She looked at Joe directly. I love you. That's what it is. Joe exhaled. small, careful. The sound of something held at a specific tension for a long time, released. She didn't say it back. Eleanor had not expected her to and did not need her to. She sat in the chair and let the sentence exist in the room without requiring anything from it, which was the first genuinely unguarded thing she'd done in this apartment since January. The attorneys are going to be unhappy, Joe said, finally. Extremely. And the board. There'll be a conversation I won't enjoy. Joe looked at her with the expression Eleanor loved most, half reading, half something warmer, not trying to be only one thing. You gave up the control provision. Yes. That took 3 weeks to negotiate. I know. A beat. Okay, Joe said. The open version. The one with room in it. I'm going to call Albany. I'm going to ask if the start date is flexible. Eleanor kept her face still. I'm not staying because you said the word, Joe said. I need you to understand that. What I'm saying is, I want to know if there's room. Before I decide what I'm deciding. That's fair, Eleanor said. Go make coffee, Joe said. I'll be out in 10 minutes. Albany had room. 6 weeks either way. Joe told Eleanor at the kitchen island, both of them with coffee, the morning still gray outside the window. She said it plainly, the way she said things that mattered, no theater, no softening. They said August 1st is flexible. I have time. To decide, Eleanor said. To see what deciding looks like. Joe wrapped both hands around her cup. That's not the same thing. Eleanor understood the difference. She'd been confusing them for 7 months. Marcus called at 8:53. Eleanor saw his name and looked at Joe across the island. Joe looked back with the specific patience of someone who has decided not to listen to a conversation that isn't hers but is also not moving away from it. The attorney called me, Marcus said. No greeting. About the sole discretion clause. I know. You negotiated that for 3 weeks, Eleanor. I know that too. The board is going to want an explanation that makes sense. Tell them I've revised my assumption that my individual judgment was the most reliable instrument available for decisions of this size. Tell them joint oversight is appropriate and Kestrel's team agrees. If they want more than that, I'll be in the building Monday. She paused. The deal is clean, Marcus. The close is the 22nd. That's what matters. She hung up. Joe was looking out the window, both hands still around her cup. How bad, Joe said. A quarter of board friction. A conversation I won't enjoy. But the deal is fine. The deal is fine. Joe turned back from the window. You didn't have to do that. I know. The clause. Priya. You didn't have to. The clause was about control, Eleanor said. The call to Priya was about the record. Both of them needed to happen regardless of what you decided about Albany. She looked at Joe directly. I'm not presenting you with a bill. Joe held her gaze for a moment. Something in her expression settled, not all the way, not yet, but in the direction of something real. Okay, she said. The open one. Then, what are those buttons actually for? Eleanor looked at the jar on the windowsill. I've been asking that for 7 months. I know. I never answered. Joe turned the cup in her hands. I used to sew. When I was a kid, my grandmother taught me. I kept the buttons because they were hers, the ones left over from things she made. I don't sew anymore. I just kept them. A pause. I put them on the windowsill because the light comes through them in the morning. Eleanor looked at the jar. The morning light was doing exactly that, moving through the glass and the buttons inside it, ordinary and specific, catching the gray of the day and doing something better with it. Why didn't you just say that in February? Eleanor said. You didn't ask the right way. Joe's mouth shifted toward something. You asked what they were for. I told you, buttons. You asked why they were on the windowsill. I told you, because you never asked where they came from. Eleanor looked at her. Where did they come from? My grandmother. Margaret. She made everything. Jo set her cup down. She would have liked you. She had no patience for people who couldn't say what they meant, but she respected people who were trying to learn. The kitchen held its quiet. The buttons jar held its light. Eleanor reached across the island, not for Jo's hand, not yet, just close enough that Jo could feel the intention of it, and Jo looked down at Eleanor's hand on the counter between them and then back up. I'd like to try, Eleanor said. Not a gesture. Not a negotiation. Just, try. Jo looked at her for a long moment, the full reading expression, taking in everything and deciding what it said. Then she put her hand over Eleanor's on the counter. Warm. Deliberate. Then try, she said. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. The gray was lifting. The buttons jar stood in the window catching the morning the way it had every morning for 7 months, useful for nothing and staying anyway, kept because someone had loved the person who left them, placed where the light could find them, which turned out to be reason enough.